Our guest speaker tonight is Robert Weinberg. And just to let you know before I do more of his introduction, Robert has recently written about his topic tonight for one of our pamphlets. It'll be number 111 of our Bytown pamphlet series. So if you're a member, you should have already received our number 111 pamphlet. And if not, if you're not a member or you didn't receive one, you can purchase a copy of his topic, of his pamphlet, at our website. Robert was with the Federal Public Service for over 35 years, 28 of those with the immigration program serving abroad, and then at the national headquarters and as Director General of Citizenship and Immigration for Prairies and Northern Territories region, based in Winnipeg. And that happens to be where Robert is joining us tonight. He's in Winnipeg. One of the great advantages of Zoom is we can have someone talk about us about Ottawa and yet do it from Winnipeg. Mr. Weinberg earned his MA in Canadian History at Carleton University. Robert has written several peer-reviewed articles on immigration history and on military history. He is the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21 in Halifax, an awesome museum you have to see. Chair of the Board of Governors of the Immigration Research West, which researches the experience of newcomers to Western Canada in order to help enhance programs to assist newcomers. Robert is also the past chair of the Board of Directors of Immigration Centre Manitoba, which provides newcomers with free programs and employment, language, and training services. However, tonight, Robert's topic is about Laroque's department store, which is not in Winnipeg, but was in fact in Lower Town. Laroque's was a landmark in Lower Town since the 1910s, and Robert's grandfather purchased Laroque's in 1927, but I'll let him tell you about that. So will you please welcome our guest speaker tonight, Robert Weinberg.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Now, even before I focused on the fact that my dad owned a department store, I was aware that we had dinner later than all my friends did at about 6:30 when Dad came home from work. This was important for me and my brother because it meant we couldn't go to play with all our friends as early as the other kids did, because they were having dinner at 5:30 or 6. When I asked Mom about it, she said it was because Dad had to work to 6 p.m. And of course, in the days before evening shopping, that's when Laroque's closed. Also, among my friends, I was the only one with a dad who was not home on Saturdays because he was at work on what was usually the busiest day of the week in retail. One of the difficult things for me when I was a kid and started school was how to answer the question that all of us got asked. What does your dad do? And there were also countless forms at school which included questions about our parents' occupations, and the boxes were very small, so I couldn't put in runs a department store. So I asked Dad what I should reply, and in his typical modest way, he said, write in merchant. So I finally had a one-word description of my dad's profession. But behind that one word is a story of 2 families and a business, and that's what I set out to tell in that pamphlet, The Store. Now, before I return to my own memories, I will, with the help of the illustrations in my booklet, give a quick overview of the history of Laroque's. And as was said earlier, if you don't have the booklet, it can be ordered through the HSO website. So just give me a second to do the screen share. Is everyone seeing the slides now? Good.
That's good.
Okay. I'd like to start, as those of you in Ottawa did, with a land acknowledgement for Winnipeg. And Winnipeg is on Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. The picture is Lower Fort Garry, where Treaty 1 was signed in 1871. Well, this is the picture that's on the cover of the pamphlet, and I first saw it hanging on the wall in my dad's office in Laroque. And after the store was closed, he took it home to his home office, and now it's in my possession. And it was very important because when the building was restored, I was able to lend the photograph to Barry Podolsky. So he based the restoration of the building on this photograph. It was taken just before it opened. I'm not sure whether you can see the cursor, but if you look closely on the windows, there are soap markings so that the construction workers realized that the windows were in place. Now, this was built by J. Alphonse Laroque, and he had a general store at 270 Dalhousie Street. And this is the building that it was located in. And he watched as the English Canadian merchants built department stores on Rideau Street and on Spark Street. And he felt there was a need for a department store to serve French Canadians. And he set about planning to build this. He started assembling land between Rideau and George Street, close to Dalhousie. And the final piece of land that he needed was City of Ottawa right-of-way, which I guess was originally reserved for the streetcars. But they put it up for sale in 1921 or 22, and he purchased that and started to build what became Laroque. This is a photograph that's probably more interesting for the steam shovel and the horse-drawn dump truck in the construction site than anything else. The building was built very quickly. It was started in the summer of 22, and it was open in May of 23. It was concrete construction, and it was stressed to take 2 additional floors. So Mr. Laroque was already thinking in even larger terms than the building that opened in 23. On opening day, it was a big hit. You can see all the people lining up waiting to get into the new store. And going the length of Dalhousie Street, one of the assets of the building was that it had more display windows than any other department store in Ottawa. Monsieur Laroque had ensured too that all his staff was bilingual. And so this was the first department store in the city that was able to serve every Ottawan in whichever language was their native tongue. Laroque took its place with other landmarks. On the left side of Dalhousie in the distance is the Monument Nationale, which was the social center of French Canadians in Lower Town. So that the corner of Dalhousie and George Street really was very important for the French Canadian population in Ottawa. Now, over the years, the store grew both into the first building and into neighboring buildings. When Monsieur Laroque first opened, the store was on the ground floor and the basement only, and the upper floors were let out as offices. He unfortunately overextended himself and went into bankruptcy protection in 1926. My grandfather, Joseph Weinberg, who was living in Montreal at the time, came to run the liquidation sale of Laroque. And he did so well that he decided to purchase it. And of course, he was able to purchase it from the liquidators for a lot less than it had cost to to be built. So he was carrying less debt, and that made it more profitable. Plus, by that time, he had a steady flow of income from the upper floors, which were rented by the federal government for the headquarters of the newly formed Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And they stayed there until the early 30s. And then in one of those coincidences of history, the Laroque building was used for those upper floors for the secretariat that planned the Empire Economic Conference in 1932, which was R.B. Bennett's attempt at dealing with the Depression. But the person who organized that conference was my maternal grandfather, Harry Kogel, who was in the army, and in those days, a lot of the organizational capacity of the government was military. After those floors became vacant, my grandfather Weinberg used them as retail space, and also purchased the buildings beside on Rideau Street. So it was quite an expansion. And you might wonder, why was this happening in the middle of the Depression? Well, Ottawa was somewhat insulated from the effects of the Depression. The federal government kept people on. Salaries were reduced by 10%, but people weren't let off. So Ottawa was quite insulated from the Depression, and it meant that people were still buying things, and retail was pretty good. And then during the war years, it was even better, because people flooded into Ottawa to work in the war effort. And while there were price controls and profit controls, up to that, you could make a lot of money. And that's what happened. And this continued into the 50s with the baby boom and the continuing prosperity of the country. You can see in this picture the streetcars coming along Rideau Street with a stop right outside the store, and there was another streetcar line that went down Dalhousie. So it was very easy for people who didn't own cars to get to the store. But in that prosperity was also the seeds of the demise of Laroque and also other community department stores. In 1955, Westgate opened. That was the first mall in Ottawa. It was followed shortly after by Carlingwood, and the anchor tenant there was Simpson Sears. There was a small Freeman's in Westgate, but Simpson Sears was the first large-scale suburban department store. And of course, these started drawing custom away from the downtown department stores. The other thing that happened that specifically affected Laroque was the Lower Town redevelopment, which at that time started out as a fairly limited project covering about 30 acres in Lower Town, but ended up covering about 125 acres and moving thousands of families out with the promise that they'd be able to move back in 2 years. And that never happened. So the rebuilding of Lower Town took much longer. A lot of people who moved out to the suburbs stayed and never came back. And of those who moved, 600 families had revolving accounts at Laroque. And basically the loss of those 600 families was the difference between a healthy profit and a marginal operation. So ultimately, by the end of the 50s, or end of the 60s, sorry, and early 70s, the writing was on the wall. Laroque was not making a lot of money. As you can see, there was my father and my uncle, who are now running the business, did renovate the building, painted it white to try and make it more, literally more visible to people and draw them into it. And also they put in a bigger radio, TV, and record department, which in the last years was run by my brother Peter. And it was one of the parts of the store that was really quite profitable right to the end, but overall it wasn't. And rather than keep going until they couldn't anymore, my father and my uncle made the decision to close the store on December 31st, 1971. And they retained ownership of the building, and shortly after the closing, repurposed it as the general store, subletting the ground floor to various merchants and renting the upper floors as office space. But that concept was a little bit ahead of its time, and it really only had limited success. And ultimately, my dad and my uncle decided to put the building up for sale, and it was purchased by Mr. Toth, whose family owned Dwarf & Furs and a number of other businesses. And it remained empty for a number of years until they committed themselves to a major redevelopment. And in doing so, they turned to Barry Podolsky, who had a reputation of being a restoration architect and sensitive to buildings history and location. And he came up with the concept of a building with a central atrium and a new dome over that, small towers on each end to better define the structure. And the additions beyond the original 1923 building were inconsistent in style, and Barry's renovations extended the same facade design along both George Street and Rideau Street. So the exterior of the building is consistent in that way. Now, it was going to be called the Laroque Building until Barry remembered the old Flying Mercury that was originally located on the Sunlight Building at the corner of Bank and Sparks. And it was the Historical Society that saved it when that building was massively renovated and modernized and was really unrecognizable. And when he got permission to place the Wing Mercury on one of his corner towers, and it went on the corner at Dalhousie and George, the Toth decided to redesignate the building as Mercury Court, which did make sense. Someone like myself who was very attached to the Laroque name was a little disappointed, but I can understand the reasoning for trying to create a new image for the newly restored and renovated building. This is a close-up of the Flying Mercury taken by Barry. And so I'm grateful for him for him sharing it with me. This is another shot of the George and Dalhousie end of the store from 2016. And this is an overhead view showing how the building evolved over the years. The first part, very long and narrow, built in 1923, was 200 feet long and about 30 feet wide. As I said, in 1930, my grandfather purchased the adjoining property and joined it to the building, but it still had its original facade for many years. Then in the mid-50s, another addition was made to square off the building, and at that time it had about 50,000 square feet. Then during the restoration that the Toss did, they had added the neighboring property. So this is the extent of the building as it stands today. And I have a final picture that I find very interesting. This is a management team in 1953. Seated is my Uncle Nordo. To his left is my dad. And this was in the old part of the building before the addition at the George Street end was built. As the executive offices moved into that that new part of the building. I'm going to leave the screen share now and just return to talking. So as I say in the booklet, I really loved visiting the store and passing through its doors into that brightly lit world of shiny new consumer goods and hustle and bustle everywhere. Even as a child, my connection with the store made me feel part of something bigger. And I imagined myself growing up and running the store, although as a kid, of course, I had no idea what that might involve. And of course, that never happened. But going back to Dad, never having been home on Saturdays, when I got a little older, it meant that I could go downtown on my own and meet up with Dad at the store. And that's what we always called it at home. There weren't any other department stores in our life. So the store was synonymous with Laroque's for us, and indeed for all the employees, because that's where we shop. And that's where our livelihoods came from. So if I recall correctly, as young as about 9 years of age, I would take the bus downtown. We lived in McKellar Heights at that time, so I'd jump on the 61 Carling and head downtown, planning to ride home with Dad at the end of the workday. But before going to the store, I'd get off the bus at Confederation Square and explore some of downtown Ottawa. My favorite haunt was the Union Station. But usually I'd go into the Chateau Laurier first and head downstairs to the subway, as the tunnel leading from the Chateau to the station was called. And I'd enter the station that way. Sometimes if my brother was with us, we'd also take out quarters and roll them down the floor of the subway, because it sloped down from the Chateau Laurier to the station. And these two little kids would be dashing up along the subway, chasing our quarters and trying to avoid other people and porters bringing baggage from the station into the Chateau Laurier. I don't think we ever actually collided with anybody, so that was good. Anyway, I love to walk through the magnificent waiting hall with soaring columns and barrel vault, not having any idea what it was modeled on at that time, and later finding that it was the great Roman baths of Diocletian and Caracalla. And from there, I'd go into the departure hall. And for those of you who remember the station, there was a tall wall of glass, and behind it, 5 or 6 steam locomotives ready to haul their trains in all directions. And as most of you know, before flying was common, this was the busiest spot in the city. From there, it was about a 10-minute walk down Rideau Street to Laroque. From the corner of Little Sussex and Rideau, and Little Sussex was the extension of Sussex Drive north of Rideau Street, stopping at the station. Anyway, from that corner, it was easy to see the huge neon Laroque sign several blocks down Rideau Street. It was then the biggest neon sign in Ottawa. It stood the height of the 3-story building and spelled out Laroque in red and blue green, cascading down that corner of the store. And I remember asking my dad why there was such a big sign. And he said that my grandfather felt there had to be something to attract shoppers to walk that extra block or two to come and shop at Laroque, because of course it was beyond, certainly beyond Freeman's and also beyond Ogilvy's and Kaplan's. So it was important to remind people that there was another department store. Anyway, when I passed under that big sign and entered the store, I always could count on a warm welcome. All the staff knew me as Mr. Lloyd's son and greeted me by name. The store was indeed like a second home. I felt in the midst of something big and important when riding the elevator to the 3rd floor where my dad had his office. The store's elevator had operators wearing white gloves, and long after automatic elevators became common, I asked my dad, why didn't he install automatic elevators in the store? And he explained to me that the elevator operators doubled as hosts. They knew where everything was, and people preferred asking them for directions rather than looking at the store directory. And in thinking back, I would sure appreciate that level of service in stores and malls today. Anyway, I didn't need to ask directions to my dad's office or even tell the operators where I was going. They knew the 3rd floor. And at the north end of the 3rd floor were both the accounting office, filled with clerks hammering on those big old IBM adding machines, and the executive offices. The telephone switchboard operator, busily handling all the calls coming into the store, doubled as a receptionist for the executive offices. And she always had a nice smile for me, no matter how busy he was. My uncle Nordo, being the older brother, was president, and he had the slightly bigger office, while my dad was vice president. So if Nordo were there, I'd always peek into his office first to say hi, and then go to my dad's office. I tried to time my arrival for afternoon coffee break, because my dad would join a number of other Rideau Street merchants for coffee at the Honeydew restaurant, which was at that time on the other side of Rideau Street, about a block towards Confederation Square. And it was really fascinating to listen to these successful businessmen, the Kaplan brothers, Toby Apple, who had a women's dress shop, the Slovers, whose department store was where the Byward Parkade is now, and others talking about politics and sports and occasionally business. And I remember they were all uniformly kind and friendly to me. So I really looked forward to that. Through the store, I also learned firsthand about the Holocaust. Laroque did not have an in-store alteration department. Dresses and suits requiring alterations were sent to a tailor shop that was half a block away on Dalhousie Street. It was owned by a gentleman by the name of Mendel Good. I remember him as a kind and gentle man who always had time to chat with me. Mr. Good also always wore a white short sleeve shirt, summer and winter. And because of his short sleeves, I and others could see a number tattooed on his arm. I realize now that he wanted people to know that he had survived the Holocaust. And I'm glad he had Laroque's alteration business. He was about 14 years old when World War II broke out. He was the only one of his immediate family to survive 6 years of concentration camps before finally being liberated by the Americans at the Ebensee concentration camp just east of Salzburg. And although he knew nothing about tailoring at the time, he did know that he wanted to get to Canada. He had a distant relative living in Montreal. And he was managed to get admitted to Canada as part of the 2,000 Jewish tailors permitted to immigrate in the post-war years, the so-called Jewish Tailors Project. He arrived after spending some time in Montreal, but very quickly came to Ottawa in 1948 and apprenticed with another tailor. So he actually did become a tailor and honored his agreement. And then he opened his own business. He retired in 2006, and fittingly, he sold his business to another immigrant tailor who had immigrated from Haiti, and it still operates under the M. Good name. He passed away in 2020, leaving 3 children and 8 grandchildren. Now, when it was time for me to consider university, I initially thought about following in my dad's footsteps, getting a commerce degree followed by an MBA and eventually taking over the family business. Even though that was not really my personal preference, I was interested in history and in politics. But when I spoke to my dad about it, his response was, don't expect that the store will be there forever. This was at least 6 years before my father and my uncle did eventually close the business. But it shows that Dad was thinking ahead and could see that independent community department stores could no longer compete with the buying power and advertising clout of the national department store chains. As my uncle said in an interview with Le Joie, at the time of the closing, Laroque's was in a difficult position because it was neither too small, it was neither small enough nor large enough to survive in the modern retail environment. So I found when I was at University of Toronto, many of my friends were taking courses to prepare them to go into their family businesses, in which, like me, they had no interest, but they were doing so because their parents insisted. So I felt really blessed not to have been under that pressure. Still, it saddened me when the day came to close Laroque's. I was still at the University of Toronto in the fall of 1971, so I didn't experience the going out of business sale until when I came home for Christmas. And by that time, the store's shelves were quite bare. It was actually only after graduation in the spring of 1972 that it really hit me that the store was gone. After graduation, I decided to rent my own apartment in Ottawa while doing my master's degree at Carleton. And among other things, I was looking for a filing cabinet. And my dad mentioned that there were still a few filing cabinets left in the store and that I could come down with him and choose one. Entering the almost totally empty store came as a real shock to me. Though I knew what to expect, actually seeing it was quite different. Each floor of the great building now simply a sea of concrete pillars stretching into a dimly lit distance, and it made me very sad. It deepened the sense of loss that I already felt for the business. Because this building had been always there, it was always part of my life. So I chose my filing cabinet and returned with Dad. And now 50 years later, every time I think of that experience, I can still feel the emptiness that I felt as my dad closed and locked the doors of the place that would never be Laroque's again. But happily, the story didn't quite end there. First of all, my dad and uncle looked after their staff as if they were family. The sales area was reduced floor by floor during the closing out sale. This made sense as there was less stock to sell, but it also gave time for my dad and uncle to use their connections in the Ottawa retail community to find opportunities for the managers and staff. And this included my brother Peter, who, since my dad was friends with the Nichols family, arranged that he could join Dalco Printing as a salesperson. And Pete eventually became director of sales at Dalco. And there's a connection there too. Deirdre Nichols is Mr. Laroque's granddaughter. So as they say, Ottawa was a small place. But anyway, by the end, when the store closed, not a single employee was left unemployed. Laroque's truly was a big family. And it makes me very proud of my dad and my uncle, knowing that they looked after their staff right to the end. Now, once the store did close, I had to learn what I had started learning while we were at university, namely how to shop, especially for clothes, because pretty well everything I wore came from Laroque's. And I hadn't had to worry about price. Learning to comparison shop and buy things was alien to me, because I took advantage of the boss's 40% discount. And it was a shock to have to pay the full price elsewhere. Now, on the other hand, the closing of Laroque's actually came as a big relief to my mother. First of all, she knew that Laroque's viability had been a worry for Dad for years. And second, whereas only shopping at Laroque's was so convenient for me, for Mom it was a constraint. There were and are so many lovely dress shops in Ottawa, but the wife of the owner of Laroque's could not be seen wearing an outfit that came from another store. So in 1972, for the first time since marrying Dad in 1940, she could shop for dresses anywhere. And I recall how her wardrobe changed dramatically in those years. For Dad, it was liberating too. He had already done a lot of volunteer work in Ottawa, serving as president of the Ottawa Kiwanis Club, as chairman of what was then called the Red Feather Campaign, and later United Way. And he was president of the United Way for many years as well. In the early 1960s, also Charlotte Whitten appointed Dad as vice chair of the Board of Trustees of the about-to-be-built Riverside Hospital. Shortly after its opening in 1967, he became chair of the board. He really enjoyed the challenge involved in hospital administration and being free of the daily grind of managing the department store. So he became more involved in hospital work. He was appointed to the boards of the Ontario and Canadian Hospital Associations, as well as the Canadian Council on Hospital Accreditation, where he served as chair for many years. So the closing of the store allowed Dad to do more to give back to the community that had supported his business for so many years. There are many more memories of Laroque that I have, but I think I'll stop now and leave with one final thought. As I wrote the booklet, the store and the people who worked there will always occupy a special place in my memory and my heart. And I know for many Ottawans, especially from Lower Town, Laroque symbolized a way of life that was good, but is no more. It's passed into history. And I felt it was important to document this. So writing the little pamphlet was truly a labor of love.
I want to thank you so much, Rob. As promised, you told us a very personal story tonight. And you weave together many stories. You've told the story of your family and your role in it. You've told the story of an institution that has been so important to Ottawa and the Lower Town area in particular. And you weave together aspects of Ottawa history and Canadian history. You've given us a fabulous presentation tonight. And there are a few questions coming up, and I'm sure there's going to be more. The first one I just want to ask you about, you talked about arriving at Union Station by train, walking across Rideau Street into the market, going to the store. How old were you when you were doing
that? 9, 10, 11.
Times have changed, Rob.
Oh yeah, I mean, my parents had no concern about me taking the bus downtown at that age. You know, people would look after it. And an interesting sidelight is I happened to be attending a school that was over a mile from where I live. And we were given free bus tickets to go to school. I still walked, or my dad dropped me off on the way to work. And I had all these bus tickets. So I would use them on Saturdays. And at that time, there were zone fares in Ottawa. And you had to pay another, I think, 5 cents as a kid if you're crossing 2 zones. And because I had all these free tickets, I would offer a second ticket to the bus driver as I got off the bus rather. And the drivers would always take pity on this poor guy who didn't have a nickel to his name and say, no, you don't have to use a second ticket.
Well, those were different times. I can certainly remember hopping on the bus with friends when we were that age and going down to the Nelson Theatre and seeing a movie. I want to thank you for giving a shout out to the Historical Society. This wasn't a story I was aware of until last year. The HSO had the tremendous privilege of doing a series of interviews with Barry Podolsky, Sandy Smallwood, and David Fleming, talking about the relevance of history preservation to the relevance of history in general. We ended up with 3 tremendous interviews, hundreds of pages of transcripts we've been going through. We'd like to put that together as a pamphlet as well. But one of the stories Barry Podolsky tells was in the 1980s, he was a speaker at one of these HSO speakers presentations. I don't think it was Zoom at the time. And he talks about being shown this Mercury statue by the HSO, and then led to him asking if he could have it, if he could put it to a good purpose. So that's an interesting story to tell. I've also mentioned, I mentioned it, quite a few other people. My career was with the big bad Simpson Sears. I didn't start in the 50s with Simpson Sears, but I was there for almost 4 decades, starting in 1980, and having the privilege of having worked with some of the folks who were there from the 50s. So quite a history in retail. One of the things you said tonight really resonated with me, and that's that your father identified himself as a merchant. Because I can remember with the long-term folks at Simpson Sears when I started, the biggest compliment they could give you was to tell you that you were a good merchant. That meant you understood the business. That meant that you were making a difference. Another thing that intrigues me is all the windows in that building. There was a day in the early department stores, even before Laroque's, when windows were key. There wasn't really good natural lighting. And so you needed people shopping generally during the day when there was good lights. You had huge windows, especially on the lower floor, so the natural light would come into the building. In later years, retailers did not want windows. You do not go into a Walmart and see windows around the wall. The walls are for merchandising. So how did Laroque's deal with all these windows in the building? Were some of them closed up? or did they remain having natural light coming into their selling floors?
By the time I was at the store, there were solid walls behind the windows. So the displays were only about 4 feet wide. And there was a door behind the counters in the store that the dressers of the windows could access the windows through to change the clothes on the mannequins and so on. But yes, very much so. Once the electrical lighting was really in place, natural light on the sales floor was a detriment.
Absolutely. You had acknowledged Christy Nichols, who's joined us tonight. And Christy Nichols points out that not only is she joining us from California, but she is the great granddaughter of the original Joseph Alphonse Laroque. So tonight we have represented both families that were involved in the Laroque's business. And interestingly as well, I mean, this is the Zoom world. His HSO has been doing speaker series presentations since 1898. And here in the Zoom world, our guest speaker is speaking to us from Winnipeg. Our host, Richard, is sitting in Mississauga. And here we have a guest joining us from California. So, Krista, I believe the question you had was, what was the reason, Rob, that your grandfather retained the Laroque's name?
Well, he saw during that liquidation sale that the vast majority of shoppers were French Canadian. And his intuition was they stay more loyal to a business named Laroque than the name Weinberg. Plus, for a couple of years, he retained Monsieur Laroque as a general manager, but basically he was the public face of the store until, being a good entrepreneur himself, he went off and established a business again under the Laroque name. And that's when my grandfather had to make a slight change from J.A. Laroque to Laroque Registered and later Laroque Ottawa Limited. But basically it was to acknowledge that it was a French Canadian institution and it should have a French Canadian name.
Marie Renfournier points out the competition was fierce on Rideau Street between Ogilvy, Freeman, and Kaplan's. And I suppose that anything you can do to retain the loyalty of a clientele or to differentiate yourself, it just makes business sense. And obviously your grandfather and your father and uncle after them were clever business people, but who had a good idea of how to keep a customer happy.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things that was really important were those revolving accounts. It was a way of giving credit to people before there were credit accounts. So basically, people were paying for everything on time, and if you had them with a revolving account, they would come and shop at your store, not at other stores. So that was a really important element of creating loyalty as well.
Absolutely. I mentioned that I was with the big bad Simpson Sears for almost 4 decades, and the world goes around and everything comes around. And in the end, big companies like Simpson Sears failed as well. But in our dying days, what was most lucrative were our accounts. People wanted our clientele, wanted our accounts. That's what had the highest value at the time. Here's a question that's related. The Jewish and Francophone communities both have long histories in Lower Town. Would having a Jewish family maintain Laroque's commitment to serving the French-speaking community have had an impact on the bonds between those two communities?
I would think it did. Particularly for the managers, they had really good jobs, and that was important when there was still a lack of French Canadian representation in the public service, for example, to have a place where you could have a managerial job, where you could start as a clerk and end up as a manager, was important. And dozens and dozens of the employees had spent essentially their life here. Michael, looking up who's here with us, his dad worked at the store for pretty well his entire career. And in fact, he was the guy who my dad and my uncle kept on to basically maintain the building while it was being transformed from an empty shell into the general store. So I think that community connection was very, very important in a general sense, but it also created that bond with the community where it was located.
We have a question from George Old, who points out that your dad was president, Lloyd Weinberg was president of the Kiwanis Club of Ottawa in 1959, and he's wondering if there were other family connections to the great Kiwanis Club.
No, unfortunately.
May I speak on that?
Pardon me?
Hi, I'm Deirdre. May I speak on that?
Absolutely.
Well, you were mentioning Jerry Nichols, my father-in-law. I was Deirdre. I'm Deirdre Nichols. My grandfather was Joseph Alphonse Laroque. And by the way, Robert, thank you. You've done a super, super job. I'm sure everybody is really loving your story. It's very moving. I just want to say,
thank you, of course, for helping me with the part involving the story of your grandfather, because that was critical to filling out the full story.
I was delighted to do it. But I did want to mention Jerry Nichols was past president. My husband, Hap Nichols, was a past president. And they were both father and son of the Kiwanis Auto Club and both lieutenant governors of Kiwanis. So there's another connection to my father-in-law's good friend, Lloyd Weinberg. And that's probably how they met, was through the Kiwanis Club.
Yeah, and I can't speak for my brother, but in my case, after I graduated from university, I joined the Foreign Service and served overseas for a number of years. And when I came back as a public servant, I just didn't feel I had the ability to take time out of the workday to join a service club. But otherwise, I certainly would have wanted to join the Kiwanis Club of Ottawa. So over the years, I'd done my bit. Whenever there was a fundraising campaign, I'd recruit friends, including Lloyd Younger, who's on the screen, to sell candies for the Kiwanis Club, and we'd go around house to house, riding on the trunk of my dad's car and selling candies for Kiwanis.
Lovely. I did want to mention that my daughter, Krista Nichols, granddaughter of my grandfather, great-granddaughter, I should say, is very interested in Heritage Canada. She works in the United States with restorative architecture. And so I was delighted that she wanted to join us this evening. So if there's, I think you had a question, right, Krista?
Yes, thank you. It's already been answered. Thank you so much.
Okay.
So I do have some questions here about our pamphlet, and I'll just talk about that for a moment, Rob. As Richard mentioned, it's pamphlet 111 that the HSO has put out, and our pamphlet sells for the exorbitant price of $5 each. Shipping is an extra $2 if you're in Canada. We have 111 pamphlets that we put together. If you take a look at our website, you'll see about 75 of them can be downloaded for free right now, and the other ones we'll happily sell you. So you can visit our website to find out about that, including Rob's excellent pamphlet on the Laroques. We also hope to be restarting our in-person speaker series in September. So of course, we'll be bringing our pamphlets there, and you can buy them at those presentations as well. I have another question here. From what you observed growing up, what parts of running the business did you see giving your father and uncle the most satisfaction and enjoyment, and which parts did they seem to find the most challenging?
That's a good question. They were quite different people. I think my uncle preferred the salesmanship and getting out in marketing. My dad was more interested in the management challenge at a bigger scale. He spoke often of how much he enjoyed the case studies of business issues that were the basis of the Harvard MBA program. And I think really he got more satisfaction out of the work he did in the hospital sector in his later years than managing Laroque. He in 1939 he joined the Air Force while my Uncle Nordo stayed to manage the store with my grandfather. And fortunately, my dad was colorblind, so he didn't become aircrew, and with that high mortality rate. But the Air Force was interested in his management skills, and he served everywhere across the country. He was in early in the war in Prince Rupert, Victoria, Vancouver, Halifax, and spent over a year in Gander, Newfoundland, while that airbase was being built. And to his surprise, he got a medal for overseas service because, of course, Newfoundland was a separate dominion at that time. He never admitted this, although my mother said to me one time, you know, your father really would have liked to stay in the Air Force, but he felt he had to go back and help in the store. And when I was able to access from the public archives my dad's war record, it was in that he had expressed his interest in remaining in the Air Force after the war.
We've only got one or two questions left unless people want to put up some more, but we're getting a lot of comments. Just as an example, thank you, Richard. Thank you, Robert. My grandparents loved the store. This would have been a great story for my mom. So a lot of great memories, generation to generation in the city of Ottawa. Here's another question. Many of the department store chains that moved into Canada's major cities and precipitated the demise of independents like Laroque's have themselves failed to compete in a modern world of retailing dominated by the likes of Amazon, Costco, and Walmart. In its time, did Laroque's find situations where it had to modernize and adapt to the times?
Well, I think that was happening all the time when it was possible. And it was basically possible to be successful in Ottawa until the chains came in. Ottawa was in a unique situation that the local department stores were serving the city so well that Eaton's, which had been here, left the city. And the Bay, never had a store until it bought out Freeman's. It was the massive buying power of the national chains buying directly from suppliers rather than what local department stores would do. They would buy through wholesalers. And this created a price differential that was hard to match. Plus, the chains like Simpson Sears were building in shopping centers, and as public transit quality was reduced following the end of the streetcars, and more people were living in the suburbs and wanted to drive, they found it inconvenient to try and find parking downtown and shop there, whereas they could shop more conveniently in the malls. So this has been a long process that I think hit community department stores first, and then hit national chains, particularly Eaton's, and we're seeing the evolution too with the Hudson Bay Company, for example, here in Winnipeg. The COVID crisis basically forced them to close their flagship downtown store, and it sat empty for about a year and a half. You may have seen in the news that a deal has been struck with the Organization of Southern Chiefs in Manitoba, which is basically about the 30 First Nations bands in southern Manitoba have undertaken to take over the Bay building, and with the support of all three levels of government, converted it into housing for Indigenous elders, a museum of the Indigenous people, plus food and shopping. So it would be a mammoth project that will help create the profile for the Indigenous people in downtown Winnipeg that's been missing. And the irony is not been missed that they'll do it in the flagship store in Western Canada of perhaps the greatest symbol of British colonialism in Canada.
Life is full of irony. And I can tell you that part of the history of Simpson Sears was it was a partnership built in 1953 between Sears Roebuck in the States and Simpsons in Canada. And part of the partnership agreement was this new Simpson Sears would not enter the primary markets where Simpsons already had a good hold. This forced Simpson Sears to take a look into what would be considered secondary markets. Ottawa was certainly one of the larger secondary markets, but this also affected places like Peterborough and London and Kitchener, where perhaps there wouldn't have been a major department store. And that forced Simpson Sears into these markets, which again, a city like Ottawa was renowned for its strong independent retailers. And it really took some kind of retail revolution to shake those foundations. I can also tell you, flash ahead 6 decades later, and the closing of Sears, as it was known, Sears Canada, in 2017, when you talk about empty floors, clearances where there used to be merchandise, we were not a family business, but I can tell you after 6 decades, the people in any company become family, and it's a very difficult process when you close down and say goodbye to it all. So I don't have any other questions coming in. At this point, I would invite anybody else who would like to ask a question or perhaps say something. You can turn on your mic if you'd like, if you have anything you'd like to ask Rob or say to Rob. If not.
Well, Rob, David Jeans, I'll just say, Rob, I was very interested when you pointed out the importance of the streetcar stop in front of the store and the fact that there was streetcar service to the store, both directions along Rideau Street and also down Dalhousie. And I guess that extended the reach for some of the Francophones, because those streetcars, they went to Beechwood, and they went to the Rideau River, of course, so fairly close to Eastview, Vanier, right? So probably, they really helped give your store a much larger catchment area than would have been possible without that streetcar network.
Oh, undoubtedly.
Well, again, I want to, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to thank Robert for mentioning my dad, who was one of the employees at Laroque. He worked there, as Rob said, for his entire life, as many other employees did as well. And yeah, his father did help these families, my dad as well, after the store closed. It was pretty dire times for the employees, and it was much appreciated by everybody. I should mention too that when I was much younger, I even had a summer job as a student at Laroque, working in the window dressing shop. And it opened up another era to watch the people in advertising. We take for granted today all of the signs that people make, but these are all done by hand. And I remember in the advertising group, there was a guy called Scotty, and he always impressed me. He was able to make these signs for things for sale by hand, and very like perfect, like it's Photoshop perfect back then. And again, the Rocks too, it was a real family, all sorts of people who had worked there for a long time, in the menswear, in the recording, in ladies' wear. And yeah, it was quite a community. And again, thanks to Robert too for putting this in pen and recording the history of this great institution.
Thanks, Mike.
Anybody else tonight?
Trying to get unmuted. Right.
You are.
Yes. I'm older. I worked at Laroque's from 1957, and I was put in charge by Lloyd to sell even the water fountain, the different things that were on the floors. And we sold them to different people. The RA Center on Riverside Drive took a lot of the shelving, the racks, things like that, even some of the lighting. And that's what I was in charge of in 1972. And then Mr. Schaefer, who had Schaefer's store just down the street on Rideau, he came to me and he said, I would like to buy the water fountain. I said, well, I better find out because I think it's still hooked up. So, of course, they were picking stuff up later, but we managed that. And then he said, where are you going to work after? And I said, well, I'm not sure. And he said, well, we have an opening in our accounting office where you're from. And he said, it's running a National Cash 33 machine. I said, yes, I do that. I've been doing it here since 1957. He said, very good. He said, I'll take your name and your phone number and we'll definitely be calling you. So I went from Laroque's I went to Slover's for a year, and then the RA Center called me and of course offered me oodles of money. So that's when I went to the RA Center, and I worked there for 27 years. So
That's quite a story.
I've been retired for 25 years.
Anybody else with any questions or memories they'd like to share? Well, if not, Rob, I want to thank you very much. You've talked about a very important institution. You talked about your family, which was very important to the city. And as promised, it was a personal history. You've made us feel like you were in your shoes. As a 9 or 10-year-old boy coming from Union Station, as a student in university, trying to figure out your future. And we want to thank you so much for that. Again, Rob's pamphlet is available. Visit our website. It's a great pamphlet to read and keep. And
just say excuse me.
Hey?
Just say excuse me.
Just if I could make a quick
Sure,
addition.
David.
Yeah, just a curious thing. The lady who just spoke, you have the same picture on the wall behind you that I do on the wall behind me, and it's appropriate for Rob because it's a painting of Union Station as it existed when he loved to visit at the age of 9, which is also when I arrived at Union Station from England at the age of 9. So we share that experience too, Rob.
It's also my desktop image too, so it's a popular painting.
Well, my husband worked at Union Station. That's why we bought the painting many years ago.
And Rob, did you have anything you'd like to add to conclude the evening?
Only again to thank everyone for joining for this presentation. I see most of the people who were here at the beginning are still here, so I guess that's a positive thing. Thank you for all of you who have also shared your personal memories of Laroque, and thank you to the Historical Society for making it possible that there's now in printed form at least a short history of the rocks.
Well, I thank you, Rob, and I invite everybody to join us exactly 4 weeks from tonight for our final spring HSO Speaker Series presentation featuring Grant Vogel from the Bytown Museum. It's called The Local Canvas, Paintings from the Bytown Museum Collection, and you can actually visit our website to pre-register right now if you want to. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you especially, Rob.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you. Good night.